Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why some kids seem to struggle with big emotions and acting out more than others? And how their genes and the world around them play a part? Well, this new study dives right into that, looking at how our genetic makeup might interact with the environment to shape behavior as kids grow up. Imagine a huge study following over 10,000 kids for about 5 years, starting when they were around 9 years old. That is the incredible resource these researchers used. They wanted to figure out if having certain risk genes for acting out, which they call genetic liability to externalizing, makes things worse when kids also face tough environments. Think about things like growing up in poverty, experiencing trauma, or even things like prenatal substance exposure. They're asking if these tough environments can really amplify the effects of those genetic predispositions. So, how did they test this? They used a fancy statistical tool called latent growth curve modeling. Don't let the name scare you. Think of it like this. They were tracking how kids' levels of externalizing behaviors changed over time. Externalizing behaviors are basically actions that go against the rules or can be disruptive, like aggression or rule breaking. They looked at this from two perspectives, what parents reported and what the kids themselves reported. They wanted to see if there was a typical pattern, a starting point for these behaviors, and how that pattern changed as the kids got older. Now, for the big findings, first off, they found that both having a higher genetic liability score for externalizing behaviors, which they abbreviated as XTPGs, and facing general environmental risks were linked to higher levels of externalizing problems right from the start around age 9 or 10. So, if a kid had genes associated with acting out, they tended to start with more of those behaviors. And if they lived in a generally risky environment, they also tended to start with more acting out. This part makes a lot of sense, right? Genes and environment both seem to matter from the get-go. But here is where it gets really interesting. When they looked at how these behaviors changed over time, they saw different patterns. The genetic liability, that XTPGS, was linked to externalizing problems not decreasing as much over time, especially according to the kids themselves. It is like the genetic predisposition was making it harder for these behaviors to naturally fade away as the kids got older. On the flip side, general environmental risk was actually associated with a faster decrease in externalizing problems. This might seem a little surprising at first, but the researchers suggest it could be because kids facing more environmental risk might start with higher levels of these behaviors, and therefore have more room to decrease over time, maybe as they learn coping mechanisms or as their environment changes. It's a bit like if you start with a lower grade, it is easier to show improvement than if you are already at the top. And then came the real kicker, the gene-environment interaction. This is where they tested if the environment actually changed how the genes affected behavior. And they found a significant effect. They discovered that broad environmental risk significantly amplified the association between the genetic risk score and the starting level of externalizing problems. This means that for kids with a higher genetic predisposition for externalizing behaviors, facing a generally risky environment made those genetic effects even stronger. It is like the environment was pouring fuel on the fire, making the genetic tendency much more pronounced. They also found another interesting moderation effect when they looked at narrower environmental factors. Specifically, state-level risks, like the legality of cannabis or state policies on bias against sexual orientation, played a role. They found that these state-level factors could influence how externalizing behaviors change over time, particularly according to parents' reports. It seems that for kids with lower genetic risk, living in certain states with these specific risk factors might buffer the natural downward trajectory of externalizing behaviors. This suggests that even broader societal factors can influence how genes and behaviors interact. So, what does this all mean? The researchers highlight that these findings have really important implications for prevention and intervention. They suggest that addressing environmental risks at different levels, from the immediate household to broader state policies, can make a real difference for kids with a higher genetic predisposition for externalizing behaviors. Providing support to mitigate environmental risks, like helping families with poverty or trauma, could be especially crucial. It's about understanding that genes aren't destiny, and the environment we grow up in plays a critical role in how our genetic predispositions are expressed. Now, like any study, this one has its limitations. For instance, the genetic risk scores they used were primarily based on data from people of European ancestry. This means the findings might not apply equally to people from other backgrounds, and future research needs to include more diverse genetic data. Also, the study sample, while large, had relatively low average levels of externalizing behaviors. This means the findings might be even more pronounced in clinical populations or kids with more severe issues. The study also relies on data collected up to a certain point, and as the kids get older and more data becomes available, we'll get an even clearer picture. It's also worth noting that the researchers declared no competing interests, which is always good to see when interpreting scientific findings. Their work, however, is supported by various grants, including from the National Institutes of Health, which highlights the importance and funding focus on understanding youth development and behavior. Overall, this study gives us a really valuable insight into the complex interplay between our genes and our environment. It reinforces the idea that while our genes might give us a certain blueprint, the environment we live in is a powerful architect, shaping how that blueprint is actually built. It tells us that by creating supportive and less adverse environments, we can potentially help mitigate the impact of genetic predispositions and foster healthier development for all kids. And that's it for this week's Mind Lab. If you found this research interesting, please give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more deep dives into the science of the mind. Well, see you next time.